Hello and welcome to Golden Geography. Today we are looking at exploring oceans from the OCR Geography A-Level specification. It's part of the debates paper. We're going to start by looking at key question 1, which is what are the main characteristics of the oceans? And we have three key parts to look at. The world's oceans are a distinctive feature of the Earth, the water in the world's oceans and how that varies horizontally and vertically, and changes in light, temperature and nutrient supply which influence the biodiversity of our oceans. It's unlikely that you'll get an essay based on this, but a lot of shorter answer questions can tie into this. And this is very much the kind of sciencey bit of this oceans unit. So let's start with 1A. The world's oceans are a distinctive feature of the Earth. Well, it is called the blue planet for a reason. If you look at our planet from outer space, the majority of it is oceans. And we have a couple of maps here, one that's Atlantic centered, so centered on the Atlantic Ocean, and one that's Pacific centered, focused on the Pacific Ocean. We have 5 key oceans, and the table shows those to us in order. So Pacific Ocean is the biggest, then we have the Atlantic, the Indian, the Southern, sometimes called Antarctic Ocean, and then the Arctic itself. And we've got a whole range of data here about its area, its volume, the depths and the lengths of the coastline. So we can compare these oceans in terms of their sizes. When we're thinking about our oceans, we need to think about what lies beneath. So it's not just a flat bottom. We have a huge variety of different features on the bottom of our ocean, on the ocean floor. And we can see in this diagram that there is a big range of features. We would call them landforms, but they're under the sea, so maybe you want to call them sea forms instead, because they're found in the sea rather than on land. But it is not flat and boring down there. There's quite a lot going on. We'll start with the features closest to our coastline. And we have continental shelf and a continental slope. And you can see this on the diagram. The continental shelf is, as it suggests, it's part of the continental plate that extends beyond the coastline. So yes, you have sea above it, but it is still part of that continental plate. The continental slope is where that plate then joins down towards or flows down towards the oceanic plate. And we have the area which those two join, which is the continental rise. So we have these 3 key areas along our coastal zones, and very often they play an important role in terms of using of biotic and abiotic resources found within this zone, but that's for the next video. You can find within our ocean ridges and rifts. So the ridge we have here is at a divergent boundary or a constructive plate boundary. Where the plates are moving apart, we get that ridge developing, and right at the border we get a rift valley forming. And that's where the magma rises up. So we will find distinctive features like this within our oceans or on our ocean floors. And it's a good link through to the hazardous earth debates topic. We will also find areas of convergence where you will have one plate subducting other down below another. You will find that as they subduct, they develop a trench. If you are finding that you have continental oceanic crust and a subduction between those, you will get a trench developing. If you've got oceanic, you'll get a deep sea trench developing. And some of the deepest parts of our ocean are where we have oceanic plates converging and one subducting beneath the other. For example, the Mariana Trench within the Pacific Ocean itself, one of the deepest parts of our ocean, very dark, lots of interesting stuff going on down there, but very little known about that very deep part of our oceans. We will also find guyots within our oceans, and actually this is a little bit of a feature that ties into the development of volcanic islands. So volcanic islands are formed either where you have a subduction zone or where you might have a hotspot, that, like the Hawaiian Islands, that is feeding and producing new land through volcanic eruptions. If you are looking at hotspots, particularly as the plate moves, tectonic plate moves, the volcanic island above it will move away from that hotspot, which means it's no longer fed and it's no longer growing. That means that the volcanic island is then subject to the erosion by the wind and the waves surrounding it. And as you can see in the diagram, you get progression that takes place. And effectively a guyot is where your volcanic island has been eroded to the point where it now lies beneath, just beneath the surface of the water. And it has a relatively flat top because that's been wave cut by the waves surrounding it. So it's kind of been flattened off. Sometimes it's referred to as a table mount because it's flat like a table. But very often it will have coral around it, and that coral will act as a barrier reef initially, but when the centre of the guyot collapses even more, you'll just be left with an atoll. So we have a progression here of features that you will find. And guyots particularly are really important because that topography leads to upwelling, and that upwelling brings nutrients with it. So where you find guyots, you find lots of biodiversity within our oceans. Okay, so what about the ocean water itself? Question 1b, water in the ocean varies horizontally and vertically. So here we start with the salinity, and we have two diagrams here. We have the map which shows us horizontal variations across our planet, and it's got isolines on it. So everywhere that has a line joining it will have the same level of salinity. So you can see if you look at the Arctic, the salinity levels are quite low at about 30, whereas once you come closer to the tropics, that intensifies, and that's because of the rate of evaporation in those areas. But the area with the highest level of salinity is the Mediterranean Sea, and that's because it's relatively enclosed, there's warm conditions there, so you get high levels of evaporation, and also you've got the Nile bringing lots of sediment, including salts, into that sea itself. So we do have variations across our oceans, but often tying in to temperature, atmospheric temperature and evaporation rates. If we look at the diagram on the right, it shows us the variations of salinity vertically going down through the water column in our oceans. It tends to be quite high near the surface, and that's because we have lots of evaporation taking place, and obviously water evaporates but the salts are left behind, and also because we have that input of salts via our rivers into our oceans nearest the surface. You get sedimentation taking place, which is why the salinity decreases during the first 500 meters or so, and then it stabilizes off a little bit. If we look at temperature, it's very similar. So if we look horizontally across our planet, obviously where we have our equator and we have our highest temperatures, that's where the oceans are at their warmest. And when we are looking towards our poles, they're at their coldest in those areas. There are some variations. So if you look at the South African coastline and the South American coastline, there's a little bit of coldness coming up along those southwestern coastlines, and that's because of ocean currents and the upwelling you can get with those. If we look at the diagram on the right, we can see the variations in temperature. Again, nearest the surface, those temperatures on average are warm at around 22 degrees C, and that stays for the first 200 or 300 meters in depth. But as soon as you get beyond that, you get to areas which are too deep to receive high levels of sunlight, and so that thermal energy declines, and you have that decline to around about 1,000 meters in depth, and at that point there's very little sunlight or no sunlight, so the temperature stabilizes. An exception to this will be where you get tectonic activity and hydrothermal vents. They may produce additional sources of heat, but in general the temperature of our oceans is governed by sunlight and thermal energy from light. We also have variations in nutrients, and we will come back to this. A lot of the nutrients within our oceans comes from the coastline, so whether that is wind-blown nutrients, kind of wind-blowing nutrients off of soil or sands, or whether it's rivers carrying nutrients into the oceans. The majority of the nutrients tend to be around our coastal zones, with the exceptions of areas where you get upwelling of cold water, and with that upwelling you get nutrients being brought up from the bottom of the ocean. So our guyups are a good example of that. And again, we can see variations in our nutrients. Within the first few meters, those nutrients are used by the biology that lives there. So the nutrient levels are really low because they are being used by the plants, by the seaweed, by the phytoplankton to produce food. It's only once you start to get beyond that level that you get increasing levels of nutrients from sedimentation that is taking place, and also our organisms that are decomposing and slowly sinking to the bottom of the sea. Here's a little summary. It's kind of tying together quite a few things. So we have light in yellow, and I'm hoping you can see that that kind of matches the temperature in orange. We've got our nutrients, which we just mentioned as well. So there is some significant changes that we have, and some of them do tie together with each other when we are looking at those variations within the water column. Okay, so we know a little bit about our oceans, but we've already mentioned this. We find currents within our oceans, and actually they are referred to often as the thermohaline, so thermotemperature haline, salt circulation, because those two factors play a key part in helping to drive these currents. In general, you will find that the warm currents are on the surface, and the colder currents tend to be much deeper in the ocean, and that's due to changes in density and in the amount of salt within your oceans that causes the water to sink and to return. So it's a little bit of a conveyor belt that we have, and we have some key areas within our oceans where we have this taking place. So the Pacific Ocean, the North Pacific, we'll talk about what's happening there a little bit later on, but we also do have the North Atlantic, and here in the UK the Gulf Stream and that North Atlantic current is really important because it keeps us warm. Without it, we would be a lot colder. And that is key. Here we can see a little bit closer that North Atlantic current coming up to our coastline, and it kind of splits and then it circulates around other parts of our ocean and North Atlantic Ocean, but it does cool and then return. The problem we have is that climate change is causing the Greenland ice sheet to melt, and it is adding fresh water to the North Atlantic, and that is changing the density of the currents that we have here. It may shift it further south, it may turn it off altogether, and that could be a problem for us here in Northern Europe because we don't entirely know the effects that that will have. Certainly it could lead to colder climatic conditions, but it may have significant changes to our biodiversity as well. 1C, changes in light, temperature and nutrient supply influence the biodiversity of oceans. So our oceans are just full of living things that are both beautiful and fascinating. Light can play a really important part to that. Light is the source of energy that starts plants and phytoplankton to photosynthesize. So plants particularly are the start of our food chains, which we'll look at in a second. So light is really important to that. But with increasing depth, that light diminishes and there is less of it. So we find variations of biodiversity within our oceans. And temperature is tied to that. The temperature of our ocean is tied to the amount of light and thermal energy that it receives. Here I've tied together some of the things we've already looked at in terms of our thermoclines, our temperatures of our oceans, our nutrients that we find within our oceans, and here we have on the left the water column and how it's divided up. We've got different zones, they have a range of different names, but effectively the first 200 meters is where we have the most light, therefore the most biodiversity, and that biodiversity is using nutrients up. So we have very low levels of nutrients because they're used within that ecosystem. The further down we go into the oceans, there's less light, colder temperatures. There is more nutrients, but the conditions means that organisms have to adapt, and that can be quite difficult. So there's less biodiversity further down into the depths of our oceans. So what we want to do is compare that very top level, particularly near our coastal zones, which have a lot of light and warm temperatures and lots of nutrients, to areas that are much deeper. And this is where we can look at both our food chains, very simple food chains, but also food webs, and have a look at the different types of biodiversity that we find. So here I've got intertidal food chain, so we're looking at a coastal zone that experiences tidal conditions, and here we would expect to have and do find higher levels in terms of temperature and light, and that enables this greater biodiversity. But even in the depths of our oceans, we do get some ecosystems. They might be a little bit more simplified, they may not have the complexity because of the more challenging environment, the colder temperatures, the lack of sunlight, but there is some evolution and adaptation that has taken place that enables very distinctive ecology to exist in the depths of our oceans. And here we can see some variations. We've got right at the top within the first 100 meters in the euphotic zone, lots of light, lots of phytoplankton, zooplankton taking place, creating and building that ecosystem. But in our deep ocean, beyond 3,700 meters, actually what was living there tends to be a lot less complex, and it might be more based on the decomposition of other organisms that have died and sunken to the bottom of our oceans. So we do have variations here. Okay, so pause the video, have a look at these key points, use your green, amber and red if it's totally understandable and you really got it, green. If you need to go over it a little bit more, amber. If you really don't understand, red. And for anything that's red, pause the video, go back and have a look again. Thanks for listening.